Well, good afternoon, everyone. Happy Monday, and thank you for joining us for our third workshop for the Local Partnership Program. So we'll go ahead and get started. Next slide, Kayla. So I want to do a little bit of welcome and introduction. So if no one knows me by now, I'm Christine Gordon. I am the program manager for the Local Partnership Program. And I'd like to introduce the LPP team, -1. So Kayla Giese, she's our program analyst, and she will be assisting today. And Anya Allenbacher, she is not joining us today. She is the other program manager, and she specifically focuses on the local partnership formulaic program. So next slide. So we're going to have Kayla is going to go over the webinar logistics for today. So Kayla, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Christine. Welcome everybody to our November LPP workshop. Our workshops normally take place in different locations around the state. However, containment measures surrounding COVID-19 have required us to adjust to a webinar format. Please bear with us should we encounter any technical challenges. The workshop agenda is located under the Handouts tab and can be downloaded and saved during the webinar. It can also be found on the Commission's website. For participants joining us through GoToWebinar, please find the webinar panel located on the right-hand side of your screen. There you will find the audio question and handouts tab. Under the audio tab, you have the choice to listen in via the computer or telephone option. If you prefer computer audio, please select the appropriate box. If you prefer the phone call option, select the corresponding box and dial the phone number, access code, and audio PIN as directed by the automated system. Please note that if the audio PIN is not entered, you will remain in listen-only mode and you will be unable to speak should you have a comment. As a reminder, each registered attendee is provided a unique link and phone number to access the webinar. These cannot be shared with other participants as they are registered to a specific attendee. We welcome comments and questions from attendees as part of each topic on this workshop. There will also be an opportunity for comments and questions at the end of the presentation. There are two options for participants to provide comments. You may click on the hand icon to indicate you wish to make a comment. You will then be unmuted and called upon to make your comment. Please be sure to state your name and affiliation prior to voicing your remarks. Also, please use the raise hand feature as early on into the topic as you can to give the system time to recognize you. You may also use the questions tab to submit a question or a comment. Please type in the topic you are commenting on and your comment. Commission staff will then read the comment on your behalf. You will not be able to be on camera while making comments. That's it for logistics, Christine. So thanks everybody for joining us, and we appreciate your time and feedback today.
Thank you, Kayla. And I also want to thank the Local Streets and Roads team for helping us out today. So thank you so much. So next slide, we'll get into the agenda review. So you will see the agenda material in the handouts tab on your screen. And so the following documents will be the agenda, the presentation, the discussion document that we'll cover, and then the current guidelines for the local partnership program. So today the agenda will we'll go over, give kind of a summary of the October workshop, kind of a recap. We'll talk about the program overview for attendees that are new. I'll briefly touch on that, and if there are any questions any general questions pertaining to the program, we will stay on after this workshop to go over those questions, answer any questions that anyone has. This workshop basically is for the competitive program. So we're going to be talking about a few topics for the competitive program today. In the handout that you have, there's certain sections in the guidelines that we'll go over to discuss. So hopefully you were able to review those before the workshop today. If not, like I said, this is one of the handouts that's in the handouts tab. We have a presentation from the Department of Housing Community Developments, Josh Rosa and his staff. It will be providing an overview of the pro-housing designation program. And then we'll close it by any questions, comments, and then our next steps, and we'll talk about our next workshops that are coming up. So next slide. Next slide, Kayla. So this is, we provided this last workshop. I think it's just really good to show the attendees, kind of the summary of the attendees for each of the workshops, because we're in a virtual setting. Just kind of want to give the audience a summary of the entities in terms of the state, regional, and local agencies, community-based organizations, and then other interested stakeholders that are attending these workshops. So our previous workshop, there was a total of 149 attendees. So this numbers was slightly lower. So hope to see these numbers kind of increase as we go forward in these workshops. Next slide. So I'll touch briefly on the topics that were discussed in the October workshop. So that workshop was basically focused on key topics for the formulaic program. We talked about some general guideline updates in terms of rearranging the sections in the guidelines, including existing policies in several sections. For an example, we're proposing to include some language that talks about advanced allocation. We are clarifying language in certain parts of the guidelines in certain sections. We talked about the formulaic funding distribution in terms of the distribution factors. And this was based on funding for a tax measure collected in multiple counties. And so this topic, and I'll kind of touch on this a little later, will be one of the topics that we'll be bringing forward in a future workshop. The unused incentive funding redistribution, how and when we will be redistributing the unused incentive funding. We discussed the program nomination deadline for subsequent programming amendments. This is basically project nominations that are submitted after the initial program adoption, should there be a deadline. So, and I believe this topic will also be brought forward, because I don't think that we really landed on a specific, a proposal if we were going to not provide a deadline, or if we were going to move forward with just submitting your nominations as forth. We talked about clarifying language to the project amendment section. And then lastly, we discussed the proposed deadline for reprogramming project cost savings. So that kind of gives you a little bit of what we discussed in the last workshop. If you were not able to attend the last workshop, the recording is posted on the Commission's workshop website for you to go out and view, and you can get more details of those discussions in the recording. So next slide. So as we kind of laid out last workshop, we wanted to provide the attendees the comments that were received at the workshops. And I also want to stress that these comments that need further discussion to build a consensus will be brought forward at future workshops. Just want to highlight a few of the comments, and if there are comments that the group would like to discuss further, if you can send an email to the LPP email address that you'll see at the end of the workshop, that would be that would help us tremendously. So for the comments pertaining to the formulaic distribution, like I mentioned, the distribution factor, this will be one of the comments that we will be talking about further at a future workshop. So there were concerns that several measures in a county are reducing the funding distribution amounts for all taxing authorities. So this is something we'll go back and look at and bring that, to the future workshop to talk about further. Next slide. So these comments are pertaining to the incentive funding. So I'm just going to touch on two of the comments. So one of the comments was to allow agencies to augment existing projects with the redistributed funds. requests to redistribute unused incentive fundings in a subsequent cycle. And so this area itself, I believe there was no consensus built around this one as well. So we're going to bring this one back to make sure that we're clear on the steps in moving forward with either revising the policy or keeping the policy as it is in the current guidelines. Next slide. This slide talks about the comments received in terms of programming and then some general comments. So like I said, I'll just touch on a couple. One of the comments was flexibility to reprogram funds or to allow a carryover at the end of the cycle. The next comment was increase formulaic funding minimum annual amount to $250,000. So again, if these are comments that we will be carrying over to a future workshop to talk more about these comments. Next slide. This slide deals with the project cost savings. One of the comments was in support of longer timeline and flexibility to reprogram project cost savings, and also in support of rolling project cost savings to next cycle if savings are deprogrammed in last fiscal year of current cycle. And so this is also another topic that we will be bringing forward just to make sure that we're building that consensus, making sure that the policies that we are proposing is further discussed, and we make sure that we are clear on steps in moving forward for the project cost savings. So again, these are the comments that we received. I'm going to stop there before we talk about our future. Well, actually, what I'll do is I'll go to the next slide, and then to let you see the discussions that we are planning on having for future workshops. So again, the new distribution factor, the deadline to reprogram project cost savings, the carryover of the unprogrammed funding distribution amounts. Do we continue to redistribute the unused incentive funding annually? And do we update the minimum amount to $250,000? So again, these are the topics that you will be seeing in future workshops. So I'm going to stop there and see if there are any questions. I don't see any hands raised at this point, but I'm going to stop there and see if we have any written questions that have come through.
Hi, Christine. I'm not seeing any written questions or comments quite yet.
Okay. All right. So we'll go on to the next slide. So this is these next few slides. We'll go over basically the overview of the program, and I won't spend too much time on these slides because again, if you have any questions or you'd like to talk about the program and have general questions, we will be staying after the workshop on the phone to answer those questions and have discussion regarding the general program questions. So this slide basically talks about the authority and the purpose of the program. So the program is continuously appropriated $200 million annually, and the program guidelines describe the policy, standards, and procedures that are set forth in the Streets and Highways Code section 2033, where it specifies the development of the program guidelines. Next slide. So this slide gives you kind of the objectives of the program. So pursuant to Streets and Highway Code section 2032, the program provides funding to county, cities, districts, and regional transportation agencies that have voter-approved fees or taxes dedicated solely to transportation improvements, or have imposed fees, including uniform developer fees that are dedicated solely to transportation improvements. Next slide. So this slide kind of gives you a layout of how the $200 million that's annually appropriated is distributed. So there's a $20 million set aside for the formulaic program incentive funding. And from that, there's $180 million that's distributed, 60% formulaic and 40% competitive. Next slide. So this slide basically gives you a kind of a view of what is formulaic versus competitive in terms of funding, the eligibility, and the project nomination submittals. Next slide. And then this slide gives you a list of the eligible projects through the local partnership program and their capital improvement projects, and you'll see the list here. And this is the same for both the formulaic and the competitive programs. And the projects, although we have listed here, we also list in the guidelines that we encourage projects that align with the state's climate goals. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get into the topics that we're going to discuss in terms of the competitive program. So next slide. So this just gives you a general guidelines change overview, similar to what we discussed in the formulaic program. This, the general guideline changes are proposed to rearrange the existing sections and to clarify language throughout the guidelines. We want to expand on existing sections to include policies that are currently in place, but not reflected in detail in the guidelines. As I mentioned, earlier, the advanced allocation, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And then the performance metric guidebook, which is an instructional guide for applicants. And this topic will be discussed at a future workshop. Next slide. So as you see here, rearranging the sections basically to be similar with the formulaic program, although we have decided to separate the guidelines, but we still want to kind of keep that flow with both guidelines. So as you see here, we are going to move like the eligible applicant, eligible verification, eligible projects, the distribution, and the matching requirement. We felt as though these sections were more, these are things that the applicant may want to go to find out if they're eligible, how, what's needed to determine eligibility, and then what are the eligible projects, and then it'll just go from there. So after we get to the matching requirements, all other sections will remain the same. So the next two slides, I'll go kind of give you some of the proposed changes in two of the sections where we'll be proposing to add language to clarify or include existing policies. So next slide. So here, the matching requirements. So we're proposing to add language to clarify the use of the local streets and roads program funds for the match. So we are looking at clarifying that area to make sure that agencies or applicants know that the local streets and roads program funds, they must be apportioned by the state controller's office in order to be used as match, and the project must be eligible under the local streets and roads program. The updates regarding match requirements will also be discussed in a subsequent workshop. We're looking at how we want to revise this to for smaller agencies. And so this is a topic that you'll see at a future workshop, and we can have those discussions of the proposed language that our proposed policy that we want to bring forward for the matching requirements. So next slide. So this is the proposed language to add in terms of the advanced allocations. This is similar language to the State Transportation Improvements Program, or as we know it, the STIP program in the guidelines. So we want to just add this in addition to what we currently have in the allocation section. I'm not going to read it, but this is something that you will, like I said, you've probably seen in the STIP guidelines, and so it may not be, it's not a new policy. We just want to make sure that we're clarifying it in our allocation section. So those are just two things that we are looking at in terms of general guideline changes. Okay. So before I go into the funding restrictions, are there any questions up to this point? I don't see any hands raised. Kayla, have you received any questions?
Hi, Christine. Still no questions or comments on this end.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Okay, so this part of the, we'll talk about funding restrictions. Next slide. So wanted to give you, talk about the section, and I know we've talked about this particular section in both the Congested Corridors Program, Solutions for Congested Corridors Program, and the Trade Corridors Enhancement Program workshops, where we are looking at the environmental, so the CEQA and the NEPA. So the conversations have been, they're still ongoing, and this topic will be revisited at a future workshop. So in terms of the environmental clearance being completed within 6 months of the program adoption. So I just wanted to inform the attendees for the local partnership program that these discussions are happening. These discussions will be presented at a future workshop once we've kind of narrowed down what the direction we're going to go into this particular policy. So with that, are there any questions before we move forward to the next section that we want to cover today? And I don't see any hands raised, so I think
No written comments or questions, Christine.
Okay, okay. Okay, so now we'll talk about the screening criteria.
Christine, before we move on, we did get a raised hand.
Okay.
So I'm going to turn it over to Celeste.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Our first speaker is Jose Luis.
Yes.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. It's not so much a question, so maybe it's not fair, but I wanted to say for that previous slide, thank you. We support at SACOG having the 6 months after program adoption, and I'm really glad that you guys are bringing this forward now. We have sponsors in our region for this program and for the other SB1 programs, asking us how soon they need to get their environmental cleared. And, without the guidelines being done, it's hard for us to tell them that this kind of indication is great. We can kind of tell them what they should be planning for. I appreciate you guys presenting on this and sharing.
Thanks. Thank you for that comment. Are there any other comments or questions, Kayla?
No questions or comments written in yet, Christine, and I'm not seeing any other hands raised.
Perfect. Okay. All right. So, wanted to talk a little bit about the screening criteria. In particular, wanted to get the attendees' thoughts on this topic. So, as you see in the current guidelines, we talk about prioritization of your project nomination. So when you submit if you're submitting more than one project nomination, to clearly prioritize your project nominations. And if the project is nominated by multiple applicants, the priority of the applicants should be consistent. The reason why I bring this up, in the 2020 program, some of the agencies didn't prioritize their projects, and there were I'd say maybe 7 to 10 project nominations that did not have priorities assigned to them. In addition to that, there were some projects nominated by multiple applicants that were not consistent in the prioritization. So one of the agencies may have listed it as their first priority, and the other agency may have listed it as their 5th priority. And I'm just throwing that out there as an example. So I wanted to get your thoughts, and I think so I can understand is when projects are submitted by multiple agencies, do the agencies communicate prior to submitting applications? Do the nominating and implementing agencies communicate prior to submitting the applications? So I just wanted to get, what are your thoughts on this current policy? Does it work for agencies? Do we need to prioritize? And so I just wanted to kind of put that out there to the group to kind of have a discussion. There may not be any comments to this. Prioritization may be perfectly fine. But I just wanted to kind of bring it to the group to kind of get your thoughts on this particular policy. So do we have anyone that'd like to kind of share some thoughts on this? Or if no one has any thoughts or comments or feedback, then I'll assume that, it's okay, that we can proceed with this.
Hi, Christine. We do have one hand raised, so I'll turn it to Celeste.
Okay.
Thank you. Our first speaker is Kenneth Cowell.
Okay. Hi, Kenny.
Hi, Christine. Kenny with MTC. I always thought the prioritization is a little weird because really you're going to be running it through your own evaluation process. And in the very, very rare instances where maybe a project scores the same, then maybe you'll use, and it's on the line, then maybe you use the prioritization. What I do see as helpful is it makes the applicant decide, how many projects they want, because applicants can, give you 20 applications and it's all up to you, right? But in this case, it's almost like, well, it makes the applicant go through that process of, okay, this is our most important project. So in that sense, I think it probably makes sense still to have the prioritization, even though it's, it gives us a little bit of heartburn sometimes. When it's multiple applicants, though, it's almost like then I think it's really hard for us to have that consistency there. So I think maybe if anything that could be changed or eliminated, because say like if we have two agencies, well maybe we're all applying for different projects, and there's one project that happens to be a jointly nominated one. And so that one could be number one for one agency, but another agency is like, well, we like it, but we actually want another project as a higher one. So I think there might always be some inconsistencies, and maybe that's something that we'll just have to allow. But I think, and to sum up, I think it's good to probably have that prioritization, but if there is multiple applicants, maybe they don't need to be consistent. It's just something that you kind of take into account to see like, well, this is, city A's number one, but it might be city B's number 5. And so maybe it's a number 3 for them both. I don't know.
Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that, because I think that makes it, that helps a lot. So thank you, Kenny, for that comment.
Thanks.
We have 2 more raised hands. Next up is Peter Skinner.
Thank you.
Hopefully you can hear me.
Oh, there you go.
Anyway, in regard to the multiple project nominations, kind of similar to what Kenny brought up. For example, the San Mateo County TA might be interested in, helping other applicants, apply on their behalf. And we don't necessarily want to pick the favorites out of, 4, let's say, I'm just making up a number, 4 or 5 applicants that wish to submit. Rather, it's each of these jurisdictions' top priority, but it's not necessarily any of our priorities. So in the case where we're applying on behalf of another agency, it might make more sense not to nominate, not to prioritize those.
Okay. Thank you, Peter.
All right, one more hand. Kevin Busey.
Hi, Kevin.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Hey, Christine. Yeah, I think I was going to say that one of the challenges you get is you have the sales tax authority who may have a different, who has a different board that may rank them differently. And then you've got the local agency who may have their own fee program, separate kind of tax/fee program, and have their own priorities. And sometimes you'll get differences, and you'll even get there, depending on who they have, the elected officials may have their own priorities. So you've got kind of three different things at play there. And sometimes it's a little bit hard to keep everyone happy. And I think that's the challenge that we're having, especially, I mean, I think that's what we're getting into. And you're seeing like it's ranked by the sales tax authority as like #1, but it's the local agency, it's their third project because they've submitted multiple other projects under the smaller pot of money typically. That gives you an example of kind of some challenges we run into.
Thank you for that comment. Yeah, I think that's why I wanted to kind of bring it to the group to make sure that, you know, we understood and to know the challenges that are, you know, that are brought with the agency. So thank you for that comment. So are there any other hands raised or any comments at this time?
Hi, Christine. No hands raised, but we do have a couple of comments from one attendee. These are from Bruce Abernathy. It should be one project, one application, so applicants could collaborate on the application. Collaborating agencies should at least provide an explanation of where the project fits in their priorities. Bruce also stated that he agrees with Peter when sponsoring an application for another agency.
Thank
That's
you.
it for written comments and questions, and not seeing any hands raised at the moment.
Okay, thank you all so much for that feedback. It's greatly appreciated. Greatly appreciated. Okay, so we can go on to the next section. So the next section talks about the project rating process. So this is currently what's in the guidelines, where to maximize the effectiveness of the program funds, there was a minimum request that's in the guidelines, and it's based off of the population category. So I wanted to get your thoughts on this current policy. What are your thoughts on this? Is this policy needed? And, you know, so for instance, if an agency falls or submits a request lower, so for instance, if category 2 submits a nomination that's 2 million, should that be something that we look at to say, okay, so since they didn't submit a nomination requesting their minimum, then okay, we won't recognize, you know, they are ineligible, right? So is this policy needed? Should we just allow because we have a cap, so there's a $25 million cap of requests, but do we need to place a minimum funding request on the projects that come through based off of their population? So this is another area that I wanted to open up for discussion as well. What are your thoughts on this?
Christine, we do have a hand raised, so I'll turn it to Celeste.
Okay.
Thank you. Shelley Kuan?
Hi, yes, this is Shelley Korn from LA Metro. And the question of need, I would like to answer as being, I don't know that we need this. And especially if it's based on population, I'm not sure how population is relevant to any minimum. So I would say we don't think we need a minimum. But since you mentioned the maximum, I also want to ask whether there's a need for the maximum, because the first cycle we didn't have a cap, right? And I wonder if like that didn't go so well, and that's why we imposed the cap afterwards. And also then what is the basis for the $25 million cap, and if that could be, you know, discussed further at a future workshop.
So the basis for the $25 million cap. So in the first cycle, as we all know, the program distribution was at 50% formulaic, 50% competitive. The cycle 2 and cycle 3 moving forward, it's 40% competitive, which reduces the amount that's available. So we decided to place a cap because we could possibly get a project that comes in that could take the whole amount available. So we thought we wanted to put a cap on it because it really kind of spreads out the funding to allow for more projects to be programmed and you know, to receive the funding in the program. So that was our initial thought of the $25 million cap, but we can open that up. Do we want to talk about, you know, are there any thoughts behind the $25 million cap?
Yeah, if you're asking me, I think
Yes.
I'd be open to discussing the $25 million cap further. I guess I do understand why there is a cap to make sure funds get spread around more, but maybe the amount of the cap could be on the table.
So what do you envision the cap being?
I don't know, maybe like 50 million. I haven't really put too much thought into what it could be.
So you're envisioning
25
being
million.
higher. Okay, higher than the 25 million.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Are there any thoughts on that with the rest of the group?
Hey, Christine, we have another hand raised.
Okay.
Kenny?
Again, Kenny, MTC. You know, I haven't thought too much about it. I mean, in general, we always like to be able to access more funds if we're a higher cap, but I kind of like the 25 right now just because it's we know it's something that we're used to, and that, you know, it does allow for some more projects to be funded. But I think that was also kind of a question for the commission: is this program something that you want to see kind of larger, potentially more transformative projects, or is it something that we want to, you know, spread around more like peanut butter and make sure that everyone gets a piece of it? I feel like that's a general policy question that maybe we should talk about if we really want to, you know, change that 25 million up to, you know, a larger amount. But I think I might want to think about it a little bit more. That's just kind of my off the cuff like thoughts when we're talking about increasing the maximum.
Okay. And so from CTC perspective, when we placed the cap on, that was just that, to be able to have more projects in the program and not funding 2 or 3 projects with the funding. So that's kind of our stance on it, and that's what we propose to move forward, is to continue to keep the 25 million. But that's just the proposal, is to keep forward with it. So so yeah, if there are any comments or any questions behind this, if we want to bring this forward to a future workshop to discuss it further, we can. But as it stands, we would propose keeping the $25 million cap.
Christine, we have another hand raised. David Chen?
Hi, David.
David, you're self-muted.
Oh, there you go. I'm sorry. David Chan here with TAM. I was just going to echo the same sentiment that Penny said, in that if this program was raised to 50 million, that's 1/4 of an annual amount available. And I don't think that would be a good idea. And pretty much everything Kenny said is that I prefer it to remain at 25 million so that the money can be spread out, particularly when you have smaller county that would be competing for this money. To raise the maximum amount to 50 million, you really would not give the smaller county the opportunity to compete. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment.
Hi, Christine. We have several written comments and questions.
Okay.
So first, this is a comment from Matthew Deal regarding the project rating process. What goal is is it of the LPP team hoping, I'm sorry, excuse me, what goal is the LPP team hoping to achieve by implementing the population-based minimums? It seems like by implementing these minimums, the only outcome will be to award fewer, albeit larger, projects.
So actually, this is currently what's in the guidelines now. So I wanted to bring it back to the group to see if this is even needed. So this is a current policy. And if I'm not answering the question, if the person can come off mute so I can understand exactly what the question would be.
I'll go ahead and keep reading some comments. I'm not seeing Matthew's hand raised, so you may have answered his questions for him. So the next one is from Bruce Abernathy. Keeping the cap makes funds more available to more agencies. Many federal grant programs have caps for projects and/or states. It needs to be a portion of the total fund amount available. Keep the 25 for one more cycle to test the program.
Okay, thank you.
Next from Ben Giuliani, we support the existing $25 million cap. Next comment is from David Raperta. SCTA I'm sorry, excuse me, my screen moved. From David Raperta, SCTA would oppose raising the cap past $25 million, as that would put smaller projects from smaller agencies at a disadvantage. Larger projects are generally already more competitive to go after funds from all three SB1 funding programs, giving commission staff flexibility to fund larger projects from multiple funding types. Next comment is from Kevin Busey. Would like to think about a cap more as well. I would have leaned towards reducing it to 20 million or 15 million. And then last comment is from Jose Luis. This is Jose Luis with SACOG. I don't see a need for a minimum ask. I support the existing cap.
Okay.
That's it for written comments and questions. Oh, I do have one more that just came in. From Sarkis, SBCAG supports the $25 million cap. We collectively chose $25 million as that resembles the cap used by FHWA for raise and build.
Thank you. Thank you for all those comments. Thank you so much. So if we have no other questions or comments on this section, we can move on to, we're moving along pretty good today. So we're moving on to the evaluation criteria. So wanted to give you the criterion that we'll be discussing today. And it is the regional and local transportation, land use, and housing goals criterion that is currently, and this is the language that's currently in the guidelines. So in cycle one, the criterion that was in the guidelines basically touched on the SCS, the Sustainable Community Strategy, and how the project kind of is implemented through the communities, the SCS. So in cycle two, we expanded a little bit more, and I don't want to take any of the thunder away from Josh, but he'll talk a little bit more about that. But we expanded a little bit on this to where we included some other plans and housing elements into this criterion. So, and what we're looking at in cycle three is basically addressing the climate action plan for transportation infrastructure, the CAPTI, strategy 7.1, by proposing to expand this criterion to integrate the pro-housing principles. So next slide, Kayla. So this slide will basically, so what we're proposing is we're proposing to separate out the criterion into two sections, or into two subsections. So it'll be the regional, as you see here, and then the next one will be local. The yellow text is basically the proposed, and where you'll see that we didn't change anything to the current criterion. We just added on to include the Regional Early Action Planning Grant, the REAP. And so for the proposed local sub, we're still under development with this, and we're trying to see how we are going to include, or what we're going to include in terms of the pro-housing designation program. And so with that, I want to introduce Josh Rosa from Department of Housing Community Development. He's going to present some information regarding the pro-housing designation program. So afterwards, we can talk about, take any questions pertaining to this topic. So Josh, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Christine. Can you just nod your head and let me know if folks can hear me? Okay, I think we're good. And good afternoon. This is Josh Rosa from the Department of Housing and Community Development. And I want to thank the commission staff for allowing us the opportunity to share some potential concepts for Cycle 3 in the local partnership program. These concepts really utilize two new opportunities. First is the Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure, or CAPTI, that Christine mentioned. And the second one is HCD's pro-housing program. Next slide, please. So first and most importantly, though, these concepts build on a history of previous CTC HCD collaboration. In the last cycle, our department worked collaboratively with the commission and with stakeholders to expand upon the evaluation criterion in LPP, looking at furthering the implementation of SESs. We expanded it to ask how projects advance transportation, land use, and housing goals in a variety of plans, including local level housing elements. So the distinction in the 2020 cycle was evaluating location efficiency from top to bottom, from the regional level to the local. So for Cycle 3, we propose continuing this focus with more specific links to resources and metrics. We have new resources to provide uniform guidance in regard to local policies. We want to build off the progress in Cycle 2 by laying out expectations that are clearer and more consistent to guide LPP applicants. Next slide, please. We're also responsive to the recently adopted Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure. In order to lower greenhouse gas emissions, CAPTI leverages transportation funding to reduce VMT. This applies to 7 particular transportation programs, which include LPP. CAPTI's Strategy 7 seeks to reduce VMT by incentivizing infill housing and densities that are feasible for each community, building on the pro-housing program and housing elements. So HCD will be working closely with CTC to see how we can achieve this. Next slide, please. So to help us achieve it, pro-housing is a new tool in our toolbox. The pro-housing program defines the types of local policies that advance state priorities for housing, climate change, and equity. And the pro-housing program creates incentives for cities and counties to adopt these policies. Upon request by any local government, HCD will evaluate and verify the local government's adoption of these pro-housing criteria, and local governments that adopt the criteria will receive extra credit in the scoring of competitive funding programs. So pro-housing uses an objective and uniform process of evaluating each community's local policies in light of defined goals. This creates an opportunity for any state funding program to precisely target and support the types of local policies that align with its program objectives. Next slide, please. So areas for exploration that we're floating today for thoughts and opinions and just stakeholder feedback. For Cycle 3 LPP, we wish to explore building on the existing local transportation, land use, and housing goals criterion to reduce VMT. And we could do this by incorporating selected pro-housing criteria to lay out clear expectations and a straightforward objective evaluation process. And LPP wouldn't be going out on this limb alone. A number of state funding programs will be incorporating pro-housing criteria, and local communities are already seeking to adopt them. And HCD has a staff providing technical assistance and guidance to these local communities and their regional partners. Next slide, please. So a little about how pro-housing works. The program clearly defines 39 local policy types that qualify as pro-housing policies. These include evidence-based measures in 4 categories: zoning and land use, accelerating production, reducing construction costs, and providing financial subsidies. Localities can consider this a menu of options, choosing to adopt the ones that make sense for their particular community. Next slide, please. In addition to those 39 pro-housing policies, the program also defines 8 enhancement factors, which are additional actions that communities can take to tie their policies to state goals, including location efficiency and climate change mitigation. So altogether, pro-housing establishes a total of 47 criteria, and each criterion has a point value. Next slide, please. So the local community can receive the pro-housing designation by reaching 30 points. They can reach the 30-point minimum through any combination of criteria, so long as they touch all 4 categories. We recognize in this program that every local community is different, and different criteria will be feasible to different communities. So pro-housing is designed for flexibility, establishing a wide variety of actions a community could take to advance these goals. Next slide, please. Here's an example of a local community that achieves the designation through its own combination of pro-housing criteria. When a city or county applies to the pro-housing program, HCD will evaluate it and complete a preliminary checklist indicating which criteria are met. And reaching or exceeding the 30-point minimum means the local government is designated as pro-housing. Next slide, please. HCD is investing in helping local communities participate. We have already been engaging with dozens of local governments, conducting regional and statewide workshops, and developing instructional and other guidance documents to create the on-ramps for local governments to participate in the pro-housing designation program. Next slide, please. I mentioned the incentives. Competitive state funding programs will provide additional points or other preferences to local governments that participate in pro-housing. So far, we know at least 4 such funding programs will prioritize projects that are located in pro-housing communities, and more funding programs are sure to follow. Ultimately, this work is building a critical mass of incentives for local communities to meet these criteria. A city or county won't have one reason to adopt pro-housing policies. It will have many reasons to adopt those policies. Now, ultimately, the long-term priority is that state agencies will require communities to receive the designation in order to get the benefits. But in this cycle and at this early stage, because pro-housing was only established several months ago, there could also be benefits for communities that meet some pro-housing criteria, even if they haven't received the designation yet. Next slide, please. So areas for exploration for LPP for folks' thoughts and opinions on these. And these areas would be limited to that single existing LPP criterion for local transportation, land use, and housing goals that Christine mentioned. LPP could utilize pro-housing as an objective, uniform process for evaluating and verifying local policies with clear definitions. LPP applicants could meet the criterion by showing particular pro-housing policies that reduce VMT. And we invite the thoughts and opinions of stakeholders like you to identify just what those policies should be. Other programs are working on this same thing, and we have an opportunity to align LPP with them and benefit from that model. And this sets consistent standards for local communities to prioritize. This is certainly the beginning of a lengthy and important conversation, and we welcome your feedback as we continue down this collaborative path. With that, I'll just leave it open to discussion. Happy to help with any questions or thoughts that folks might have.
Hi, Josh and Christine. This is Kayla. We do have a few hands raised, so I'll turn it to Celeste to take care of those for now.
Thanks, Kayla. We do have 2 hands raised. First up, it's Louis Zhao.
This is Louis Zhao, CTA. So I have a couple questions and comments on this. I've stated my comments before in the SCP workshop, but this workshop kind of clarified some of the things, but also added a couple things that really kind of bothered me, because when I'm thinking about the LPP originally, the intent was designed to support and incentivize measure type projects, sales tax, fees, that kind of thing for self-help counties, self-help agencies. But it sounds to me that this is going to be used as another way to create a barrier to access the partnership funds, even though I think in statute, all we were supposed to do is at least have some type of fee mechanism. So that's one comment and one question is that the intent of what you're trying to do here, is create another barrier for agencies to access the funds? So that's one. The second thing I wanted to note was that I think this is going to cause a lot of problems for a lot of transit agencies, and for us as a county transportation commission, we don't influence housing policy at all. And we have a set of projects that our voters voted on that we need to deliver, and that's what we're utilizing these funds for, or we're hoping to utilize these funds for. But putting up another barrier for us, along with a scored criteria, already puts us at a disadvantage when we're the transit provider within our county. So that's just the comment that I've been making on most of the funding programs, and I'm hoping for at least an answer to the first one, and at least a note to the comment I just made about some of us not having the ability to influence housing policy.
Yeah, so in terms of the first comment, Louis, I understand the concerns, and no, we're not trying to create barriers. We are trying to look at how we will be addressing some of these strategies that are in the CAPTI. So, and as best as we can. So not, and we understand with the local partnership program, to even be eligible for the program is a hurdle in itself. So voter approved measures, and then also imposed fees. So you've successfully accomplished that hurdle. So then here's another one. I get what you're saying, but no, we understand your concerns. We have been having these conversations with these concerns. How can we best provide to address the CAPTI, and then also meeting the intent of the program? So that's something that we are still doing. So we haven't fully decided on one way or another. And I think this is why we're having these conversations, is to hear the feedback from the agencies, hear your concerns, and to share this when we have these internal discussions, and how are we going to kind of shape this in the local partnership program. So thank you. And again, the barrier, we understand the barrier. And so in terms of the transportation agencies and meeting the goals, the housing goals, I think that's something too that we are kind of having discussions with that as well. And Josh, I don't know if that's something that's come up in your conversations in terms of the transportation agent, or the transportation agencies, and how they would be able to even meet these housing goals.
Yeah, in several forums, this has come up before. It's a very reasonable question and a reasonable concern. In fact, in the last cycle of LPP, this came up, as well as in other transportation funding programs where factors looking at land use and looking at housing were inserted, and applicants kind of thought, you know, I don't have direct land use authority, so how could I be held responsible for this? And in the last cycle of LPP, we had the transportation, land use, and housing goals criterion that asked, how is your project consistent with housing element implementation? And we're hopeful that pro-housing might actually be more of an opening of a door than it is a barrier, because one of the challenges with the last cycle is that every housing element is particular to the locality it's in. Some are older than others because they're adopted according to a staggered schedule. So everything is more particular. With pro-housing, what we have the opportunity to do is lay out a very uniform process and benchmarks for everybody. So it's more clear what the ask is and how LPP applicants can achieve the spirit of what they were really prompted to achieve in the last cycle. So we're hopeful that this is actually providing greater guidance and resources for local governments. And you know, I think that there are other transportation funding programs that are doing this, and we do run into that question of, you know, it's difficult for a transportation agency to score on something they don't have direct control over. You know, I'll say, just for our sake, we score housing developers based on transit service where they don't have control for the transit service. So I think that what we're hopeful we might do is, you know, foster all community partners to come together to look at the metrics and see how they can meet these criteria.
And I also want to add, with the local partnership program, there are 9 criterions that make up the whole evaluation criteria. So this is just one criterion that makes that total package. So to keep that in mind, and that each of the criterions are equally weighted. So there's no higher weight given to one criterion than the other. So that's kind of how the local partnership program is structured when we're evaluating the project. So I just want also for the attendees to kind of keep that in mind too. This is only one criterion of the whole big, you know, package of the criteria that are set forth in the guidelines.
All right, Christine, there are about 4 more hands. Next up is Marina Espinoza.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Marina Espinoza with the California State Association of Counties. Thank you for the informative presentation, and just wanted to share that we think it's too soon to start linking the new pro-housing designation program to the local partnership program. Most jurisdictions haven't had an opportunity to apply for the designation yet. And we're also concerned about the ability of low resource jurisdictions to access the program. The emergency regulations seem to require direct financial subsidies of affordable housing projects in order to achieve the designation. And this will likely be more difficult for counties with limited budgets or tax bases to meet this requirement. And finally, we're also wondering about how this would apply to regional scale projects. Would all jurisdictions that are part of a project be required to have reached the designation. So those are some of the things we're thinking about. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for that comment. I think these are things that we, and like I said, I'm glad that these comments are coming, because these are things that we need to go back and really look at again, how we're going to lay this out in the local partnership program, because there's things that we really need to think about. It's new. We want to make sure that we're rolling it out, and we're rolling it out to where we're not, as Lewis said, placing a barrier for the applicant. So thank you for the comments, because we will be taking that back and looking at that.
All right, next up is Adrienne Cardozo.
Hi, this is Adrienne Cardozo with Orange County Transportation Authority. I do support some of the questions that Lewis mentioned, but I also wanted to share in terms of the REAP program. Can you all hear me? Sorry, I should have asked up front.
Yes, we can.
Okay. In terms of the REAP program, I know that, or I believe in the SCAG region, the county transportation commissions will be participating in the REAP 2.0, but we were excluded from the first round of REAP, and I don't know if that's true for all of the MPOs across the state. I know in Southern California, the funding for planning went out, just to the cities and the county. So, or maybe also to, I frankly, I don't know that much about REAP, but I know that we were not able to participate. None of the county transportations in Southern California were in the first round. And, that is 4 of your self-help counties at least that could not participate in that first round of REAP. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure if cycle 2 will be up and running in time for it to be an incentive or for things to be underway based on the cycle 2 funding. So I just wanted to point out that could be problematic for some of us, because not all of us had fair and equal access to the cycle 1 funds. Thanks.
I can talk a little bit about REAP. I can't really speak to the specific OCTA issue, but REAP is not an incentive program as much as it's an over-the-counter program for planning and implementation in order for regions to promote housing production and to reduce VMT. That we're looking at adopting final guidelines and issuing a NOFA in the month of January. But it's funding that's made available to regions, and the region might suballocate or it might not. But I think that one of the criteria that we're exploring is just asking the applicant to talk about how their project is consistent with what REAP is funding, or how it aligns what REAP is funding. And there might be some things that applicants are asked to look at and reference that they may not have direct control over. But I think that is the thinking behind what we're exploring initially. But I'd love to talk a little bit more about the OCTA issue.
Well, I don't think it's just OCTA, because SCAG doesn't have self-help taxes and or fees. So, and I think what I saw in the PowerPoint presentation is that there is some sort, under the regional housing discussion, there is some sort of, it seems like there's a direction that, if projects align with REAP planning or funding, that that they're better. But I don't think those of us in the Southern California region from self-help counties were able to participate in that plan. I think there just might be a slight disconnect for our region, and it could be specific to Southern California. Thanks.
Thanks, Adrienne. I think we need to go back, because I know what you're referring to, on the slide 32, where it talks about where we added the REAP And yeah, so we probably need to go back and look at that language and how we're going to, because it may not be applicable to the applicant like you mentioned. So we'll have to go back and kind of look at the language that we have on there. Oh, Kayla, are you trying to go back to slide 32?
Yes, it's okay. We got a comment asking if we could go back to this screen anyways, so I'm going to leave this up so that attendees can look at it.
Okay. Yeah, so we will look at that.
Thank you.
All right, there are 3 more hands. Next up is Kevin Busey.
Same concern about, we've got this voter approved projects, and that's kind of why we get these LPP funds, and got these voters saying that they want these projects, and now we may not have access to these LPP funds. It seems like a challenge to me in that regard. I mean, a lot of these projects have been delivered. I might be on my last project, and now I don't have access to these funds, and that's a concern. I know as far as the pro-housing concept, I know we just went through a housing element update because of RENA starting in April 2020. We just finished it in 2021. So my concern is if we didn't sort of hit all these things that maybe will be required for the pro-housing, good score or whatever, I don't want to go back through a year-plus long process with all the outreach that we did. It's fairly controversial. So timing of this is challenging too. Just want to flag that. That's definitely a concern. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. Thank you.
All right, next up is Peter Skinner.
Hi, good afternoon again. I don't want to reiterate what others have already said too much, but speaking on behalf of Caltrain and Samtrain, we're certainly concerned about tying the development of new housing stock, with our transit improvements, especially when we have no control over what local agencies do in terms of pro-housing policies. This is especially true for a rail line like Caltrain, where we're going through 3 counties, and we have a set right of way and set corridor. So it is a barrier if it's going to be considered. Thanks.
Thank you for your comment.
All right, and the last hand we have is Nafili Barrett.
Hi, thank you. Nafili Barrett with the Mendocino Council of Governments. So, in general, I think that pro-housing can be a good thing, and a lot of our jurisdictions within Mendocino County are taking the steps that would probably qualify them for that designation. But first I want to echo the challenge of the timing. We're where we are in RENA. We're not going to be doing that in the immediate future, and it would be putting a burden on planning and community development staff who are already pretty maxed out, particularly when you're looking at agencies that are pretty heavily involved in fire recovery. That's just one more burden that you're putting on them for transportation projects to move forward. And then I also am concerned here we have cities that voters have opted to tax themselves, and our taxes are for system preservation. They're not, they're not out there building new roads with these taxes. We have very little funding in rural areas for system preservation and pretty large responsibilities. And so I'm concerned that evaluating projects based on housing will penalize the jurisdictions that have taxes that are specifically for system preservation, because projects are chosen based on system type and condition and effective use of funding when you're talking about system preservation. So it's just a different way of selecting projects that doesn't necessarily makes sense to score them based on housing, regardless of whether or not a local jurisdiction in general is supportive of housing. That project might not fit with those, but that project is what voters pass this tax to fund. So those are my concerns. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other comments? Yes.
We got one more hand. So next up is Gracia Lenis.
Okay.
Hi, hopefully y'all can hear me. Good afternoon, my name is Gracia Lenis. I work for Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, which is a nonprofit that works in the inland parts of California. I think I appreciate the direction that we're having, that this conversation is going in, and that, you know, the CTC is moving towards, you know, really being intentional around how is it that we're developing and spending our transportation dollars in a more comprehensive, holistic way that addresses, you know, not just our transportation goals, but also our climate, our housing goals and whatnot. I think one issue I do want to raise just with the pro-housing designation is the lack of equity-centered kind of policies that can be in there, and the lack of or I guess the way it doesn't really address to pass, and even to this day, some current discriminatory practices and patterns around land use developments. And so I think I gave, you know, a few examples where, you know, we have, you know, a local jurisdiction can technically be pro-housing because, you know, they're facilitating production. However, you know, they'll be continuing to either, you know, place unwanted land uses in, you know, low-income BIPOC communities, or they'll be permitting, you know, brand new like towns and cities instead of investing in existing communities. So like really addressing that. And I think one potential way of getting to that is really pushing for, I guess one way is like, how is it that, you know, as a state, we can make sure that everyone is complying with AB 686, which is affirmatively furthering fair housing, as well as AB 1771, which goes beyond, you know, goes beyond and requires jurisdictions to really force them to not just like, hey, we allocated our, you know, our regional housing needs allocation, and here's what we need to do, but actually demonstrate how they're proactively built, like, you know, supporting and facilitating that development, particularly for lower income units. And so I do want to make sure that we're having that conversation. I think, you know, I think some of the solutions that we've seen is, you know, I forgot which program it was, but like, you know, having housing element compliance, you know, it's housing elements can only get us so far, but I think at the very minimum that has been a tool that, you know, some jurisdictions or some state agencies have been able to use to get local jurisdictions to come into compliance. But yeah, I think explicitly having fair housing and equity metrics is incredibly important to make sure that, you know, we're not just building housing, but we're building housing for everyone, and we're not, you know, continuing to perpetuate past discriminatory and segregating practices. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's really helpful. If I could speak to that, I really appreciate the attention to affirmatively furthering fair housing. And while you were speaking, it occurred to me that there's in the whole pro-housing rubric and those 49 or 47 criteria that I mentioned, there are a couple that do look at strategies to prevent displacement of lower income households and strategies to affirmatively further fair housing. That might include things like updating zoning codes, outreach campaigns, and other strategies that local governments can take. And so, you know, I don't know if we can actually use all 47 of the pro-housing criteria here, but maybe those are two of them that we do want to elevate and maybe take a look at how they might be integrated to make sure that equity is still at the center of this work. So thank you for that. That's really helpful for us to bear in mind.
Do we have any other questions or comments?
Hi, Christine and Josh. We do have just one written in question. This is from Rachel Morricone. If a proposed transportation project goes through multiple jurisdictions and only half of the local jurisdictions have been able to update their housing policies by the time applications are due, would the project lose points? We would be concerned if good projects that would actually support more infill development and address community concerns about traffic in areas of higher density housing were harder to fund just because city or county policies have not yet been updated.
And I think, and if Josh wants to chime in, but I think when it comes to that, just when you submit your application, providing that narrative as to what's going on at that point, you know, I think just telling the full picture of where you are in terms of the development of the pro housing development, or the, you know, where you know, so many has applied and became certified, and the other ones. I think just having that explanation in your application would be something that we would be looking for. And I'll ask Josh, you know, is there something you want to add to that? Because I don't think that we're going to, you know, penalize you or take points away because three counties have applied and the other 4 or 5 have not. Or I think we would really need to look at that. So no.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense. And I guess anytime that you're looking at local government policies, you run into this question of what happens in the case of an intercity project. And I recall that this was something we also had to look at in the last cycle that looked at local housing element implementation and how the project is consistent with that. And I think that applicants generally did a good job in the narrative of connecting the dots and making it clear how local policies were or were not related.
Hopefully that answered your question, Rachel.
Christine, that's all we have for written comments and questions.
Okay.
And I'm not seeing any hands raised at the moment.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Josh, for that. And so with that, we're going to go into,
thank you.
I guess we're nearing the end of the workshop. So I think we're on our question and comments period. So if there are any questions or comments that you have for topics that we've discussed today, or any comments, if you want to share, now is the time, and we'll take them at this time. So I'm going to open it up for any questions or comments. Do we have any hands raised?
Yeah, we have a hand raised, so I'll turn to Celeste.
Okay.
Thank you. First up is Kenny.
Hi again. Thank you, Christine and team, for the great discussion, as usual. I'm looking forward to learning more about the pro-housing stuff, you know, as you're proposing it. One thing that I did want to really raise, and we did talk about this at the last Solutions for Congested Corridors program guidelines, is really wanting to come up with the length of the program sooner rather than later, because as you know, Caltrans is requesting project nominations for their support by early February, which means our district needs to decide by early January. And whether or not it's a 2-year program, 3-year program, or 4-year program will influence which projects we will nominate. And while, you know, Caltrans doesn't necessarily, you know, support or nominate LPP projects, you know, there are instances where we might nominate an LPP, or excuse me, a TSAP or SEC where it has complementary funds from LPP. So it'd be helpful to understand, like, well, if we are a 4-year cycle, you know, will we be able to also nominate LPP competitive projects out in years 3 and 4, et cetera, et cetera. So I know it wasn't on the topic for this workshop, but I'm hoping that we can hopefully decide on that by the end of the calendar year. So at least we know which projects we will nominate, whether it's a 2 or 3 or 4 year cycle. So thank you for your consideration.
Thanks, Kenny. And yes, so I did hear your comment at the Solutions for Congested Corridors program workshop. And yes, so all of the 3 programs, we will be getting together and hopefully having something soon for the groups to determine, what in terms of the length of the programming cycle. So thank you for that. But yes, I do have that on my list, Kenny. So thank you.
All right, we have 2 more hands. Next up is Kevin Busey.
Hey, Christine, this is Kevin again. Hey, I had a question for you. If you look at CAPTI, it's got all these strategies and it has these actions, and a lot of the SB1 programs like Solutions to Support Congested Corridors or the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program are specifically listed in what they want to see done, but LPP doesn't have a specific action associated with it. It's kind of just talked about in the background. Do you know why that might be?
So I think when CAPTI, and I'll see if Matthew is kind of out there to chime in, but I know when CAPTI was being developed and the conversations were following through, LPP was not necessarily addressed in terms of specific actions because of the intent of the program and because of the eligible applicants in terms of the self-help counties. And so I don't think that LPP, as the CAPTI start formulating LPP, there were no specific actions tied to LPP. So LPP is mentioned again, like in the pro-housing action strategy, and then also in the public engagements action strategy. So it's kind of an indirect strategy for LPP. But what we're trying to do is trying to see how we can align and address those strategies in all of the programs. And so that's kind of where we are now. And again, it's under development. This is something totally new. And so that's kind of where local partnership stands.
Hey, Christine, this is Matthew, or I should say, this is Matthew Oscott, the Deputy Director for SB1 Programming. And I'll also kind of chime in. And Kevin, thank you for the question or the observation. It's a good observation. I'll say that I think Christine hit it on the head, that the local partnership program's objective really is to incentivize at the root, agencies becoming self-help or, taking on voter-approved tax initiatives to support transportation improvements or imposed fees in the competitive program. And as Christine mentioned, it doesn't have like a standalone strategy like congested corridors or trade corridor enhancement program do. But it is mentioned in some of the additional strategies, I believe there are 8 total overarching strategies in the CAPTI. And I'll also point out that CalSTA, in publishing the CAPTI, I believe reserves the right to keep it as kind of a working document or like a living document, meaning that they will, CalSTA and their interagency working group will revisit if any strategies should be updated or removed or added. So just because there's not a LPP specific strategy now, I don't know if that means that there will not ever be included in the CAPTI or if the CAPTI evolves into an additional document. But it's a good observation nonetheless. I also think solutions for congested corridors and trade corridor enhancement program have very large discretionary, pots of funding. LPP is 60-40 formulaic competitive. So it's considered that there's a bit less discretion over, a smaller portion of funding in this program.
Do we have any other hands raised?
Yes, there are two more. Next up is David Chan.
Hi, Christine. I just want to see, I don't know, I missed the opportunity to comment on Section 3A. Section 3A currently reads that LPP funds cannot be programmed if you have LPP fund in the current cycle. And this section has worked against us, and wanted to see if there's consideration in a future meeting or consideration to remove that part of Section 3A that prevents an agency from programming more LPP formula money to a project in the current cycle.
So are you referring to, and I want to make sure that, okay, so you're talking about the supplemental funding.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, so we did bring that up, and I believe, and I would have to circle back, but I believe we did talk about that. And so I think what was in support of is that the agencies would be able to utilize their formulaic funding to program to a project in a current cycle. So if you wanted to use a supplemental funding for a project that you have already programmed in a current cycle, you would be able to do that. So I believe that's what we landed on, but I would have to circle back with Anya to see, and if we need to bring that back to the group, we will do that. But I believe that's what we landed on in the last workshop.
Okay, thank you very much. Glad to hear.
All right, we have one more hand raised. Shelley Kwan.
Hi, Christine. It's Shelley from LA Metro again. Just wondering if topics like project delivery and implementation, so like allocation requests, contract award deadlines, things like that will be discussed by program, or whether we'll come back together at that SB1 programs workshop to discuss them all at once, because they're similar across programs.
So I didn't catch all of it, Shelley. So are you okay? So you're referring to the did you say allocation and what was the other ones?
Yeah, it's just like the general project implementation topics like allocations and contract awards and cost savings.
Okay, and so are you saying is the local partnership program as a whole, so formulaic and competitive, are we going to circle back and talk about those together, or are you referring to the SB1 programs, the local partnership, congested corridors, and trade corridors?
The SB1 program.
Okay, I can take that back and with the other program managers.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Christine, I don't see any more raised hands.
Okay, do we have any written questions, Kayla, or any written comments?
Hi, Christine. Yes, we have one written question from Nafili Barrett. They were just asking if we could confirm that the issue requiring completion of a draft CEQA document will be brought up back at a later workshop.
Yes, it will. Yes, we will be revisiting that in a future workshop.
That's it for written comments and questions.
Okay. So again, if you have any questions or comments, you can always send them to our local partnership program email or shoot them to myself, Anya, or Kayla. So just wanted to give you a list of the key topics for future workshops. This, and as a disclaimer, this could change. We could be adding more on here, but currently as it stands, we will be bringing our carryover key topics that we talked about. So the distribution factors, the unprogrammed formulaic funding, the unused incentive funding redistribution, and the minimum funding amount. We'll also be bringing back the formulaic program, the project cost savings. And then also the matching requirements, as I mentioned earlier, clarifying the language for the local streets and roads, and then looking at how we can revise the matching to specifically for smaller agencies. We will be bringing back, as we mentioned, the funding restrictions in terms of the CEQA and NEPA timelines, looking at programming cycle years, and as Kenny had mentioned, trying to bring this back sooner than later due to the timelines with Caltrans and submitting projects by February, concepts by February. We'll be looking at the program schedule, kind of trying to tie down some dates on that. The project nominations, which goes hand with the performance metric guidebook. So we'll be talking about those at future workshops. Next slide. So just wanted to provide a quick recap of what we talked about. We talked about this workshop was specifically for the competitive program. We talked about the funding restrictions. We briefly talked about that. So we talked about the screening criteria. We're prioritizing the project nominations. We talked about the project rating process, the minimum funding request based on the population category. And then we talked about the evaluation criterion, the regional and local transportation, land use and housing goals. And then we had a great thorough presentation from Josh Rosa with Department of Housing and Community Development. And then we talked about kind of the key topics that we'll be discussing in future workshops. So with that, we want to inform the group that the workshop that's scheduled for December 8th will be rescheduled. There will be a workshop that will be for all three programs, for local partnership program, solutions for congested corridors program, and the trade corridors enhancement program will be scheduled in December to discuss how we're going to integrate equity into the guidelines. So that will be that workshop's main focus is talking about equity. So the December 8th local partnership program workshop will be rescheduled at a later date. And we will be sending out save the day announcements as we've been trying to, get them out. We've been trying to be proactive in getting those save the date announcements out to the group to give you some time to put these on your calendars and plan your months. And with that, we also have been posting our workshop agendas. We have been attempting to post them at least 10 days prior to the workshops. And hopefully the group appreciates, having that out there. So it gives you time to really look through to see what we'll be discussing in those workshops. So with that, I'm going to, so if there are any questions, like I said, after the workshop, these are the email addresses. You can always check the Commission's website for any latest updates, and also follow the Commission on Twitter or Facebook. So with that, here are our contacts. Myself, Anya, and Kayla, and then the Deputy Director of SB1 Programming, Matthew Yozgat. Here's his information. And so that kind of wraps everything up. And we want to thank everyone for the discussion. We are ending pretty early on the workshop, but we will be staying at least 15 minutes after the workshop to have if anyone has any questions about general programming questions, we are here to have those discussions. So thank you so much. Stay safe and have a safe holiday. Do we have any questions coming through, Kayla?
Hi, Christine. Not seeing any yet.
Okay, so we'll give it about 5 more minutes
Sounds good.
before we end.
Christine, we do have a hand raised. David
Okay.
Chan.
Hey, David.
Hi, Christine again. I missed the last meeting, so I'm not sure if there was ever a discussion about lowering the LPP formula match from the current requirement.
Oh, in terms of the match requirement, no. So what we're going to do is bring that forward at a future workshop because we really want to talk more about that. And so we just kind of, we've touched a little bit about in terms of clarifying the local streets and roads is using that as match. But in terms of how we want to revise that area for small agent and specifically small agencies, we have not had that discussion yet. So you have not missed anything.
Okay. And also as a follow-up, whether LPP formula can be used as a match for LPP competitive if someone was so lucky to get an LPP competitive grant.
So, okay, so you're asking if you could use your formulaic funding as match, and the answer would be no.
Would it be considered to be allowed in the new guideline, or that's completely?
No, that's off the table. The only funding you can use as match is with an exception is a STIP.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, David.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions?
No written questions or comments at the
Okay.
moment, Christine. I'm not seeing any more raised hands.
Okay. Okay. We'll give it a few more minutes.
Christine, we got one written question that I think is important to read out loud, asking for clarification on if the LPP workshop in December is on December 8th or it was December 8th. So Edgar Gonzalez is who asked. So Edgar, that workshop will be rescheduled, and we will be having a December workshop, but it will include LPP, trade corridors, and solutions for congested corridors together in December. So
And
that date will.
Yeah, and there hasn't been a date scheduled for that. So
Yeah, and just keep your eye out for an email, Edgar, or our website, and there will be some kind of announcement coming from us on that.
actually, you know what, Kayla, now that I was thinking, I think that the December workshop was the 14th, right?
I don't have it in front of me. Was the wrong date on there?
Yeah, the wrong date was on there. Well, it'll be rescheduled, but yeah, it should have, I
Oh,
believe.
yes, it was the 14th. Yeah.
Yeah, so so the date was the 4th. Yeah, so we'll make sure that we send out something. Or maybe put something on the website that said that the December 14th meeting our workshop has been will be rescheduled. Okay, we'll give it a couple more minutes and then we'll go ahead and sign off.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, so since we have not received any questions or comments, we'll go ahead and conclude this workshop. Thank you. This ends the recording.
Christine, we got one more written comment before we sign off.
Okay, all right.
So this is from Shannon Finley. Is the formulaic eligibility change to recognize developer fees or transportation impacts?
Has it been changed?
Yes, Shannon, if you don't mind raising your hand and we can take you off mute if you'd like to explain your question a little further.
Could you repeat the question again? I'm sorry, Kayla.
Yes, so she said, is the formulaic eligibility change to recognize developer fees for transportation impacts?
No, it has not. No. Formulaic program is applicants that have, or eligible agencies that have passed voter approved measures, tax measure, tolls, or fees. So it would have to be a voter approved measure. That's solely dedicated to transportation improvements.
Christine, no more written questions or comments at the moment, and I'm not seeing any hands raised.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and end it. Thanks, you guys. Bye.